They took everything from her in a single afternoon. Not slowly, not the way poverty usually works, grinding a person down over years until they no longer remember what they once had. Marcus Vane's men arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday evening, Clara Whitmore had nothing left but the clothes on her back and a name that meant less than the dust on the road outside. They had come with papers. Legal papers, notarized and stamped, the kind that judges in comfortable chairs sign without asking questions when the man requesting them has enough money to make questions inconvenient. They handed Clara a document that transferred the boarding house, the furniture, the kitchen equipment, and the land beneath her feet to a holding company she had never heard of, a company that, she would later learn, existed only on paper and existed only to make theft look like business. She had stood in her own kitchen, the one she had scrubbed and stocked and run for 11 years, and watched two men she had never met carry out the iron skillets she had bought with her first month's profit. One of them looked at her with something almost like pity before his companion said, quietly, but not quietly enough, "Don't waste it on her, she's already finished." They were gone before she could find words. She didn't find words for a long time after that. If you have ever stood in a room that used to be yours and felt the air itself become foreign, if you have ever had the ground taken out from under you so completely that standing felt like a skill you would have to relearn, then you already understand something about Clara Whitmore that her neighbors in Harlan County never bothered to try. They saw a widow in worn shoes. They saw a woman who had somehow lost what her husband left her, and in the logic of frontier towns in 1883, that made her suspect rather than unfortunate. People in hard places are not always cruel, but they are often practical, and a woman with nothing to offer and a story too complicated to explain quickly is a liability that a struggling community cannot afford. She had tried 3 towns before she stopped trying. If you are watching this, and you have ever been the person a room quietly decided not to see, if you know what it costs to keep asking for help after the 3rd door closes, then stay with me. Because this story is about what happens after that. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. And hit that like button so these stories can find the people who need them. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The road west of Caldwell Flats was the kind of road that existed more as a habit than a plan. Wagon wheels had worn 2 parallel channels into the prairie grass over years of reluctant use, and the channels went west because west was where people went when they had run out of better directions. Clara had been walking it for the better part of a morning, and her feet hurt in a way that had stopped being interesting some miles back and had become simply a condition of existing, like the dry cold and the smell of grass and the particular quality of light that the high plains produced in late October, and flat and gray and without warmth. She was not thinking about anything in particular when she left the road. That was the part she would struggle to explain later, to herself and to the few people she eventually trusted enough to tell. She had not planned it. She had not spent the night before working through arguments and reaching a conclusion. She had simply been walking, and then she had not been walking anymore, because somewhere between one step and the next, the reasons for continuing to move forward had become insufficient. She stepped into the tall grass at the side of the road and kept walking until the road was no longer visible. Then she sat down. The grass was cold. The sky above her was enormous in the way that the sky is only enormous when you are very small and very alone. She sat with her knees pulled to her chest and let herself, for the first time in months, stop performing composure. The muscles in her face did things she hadn't let them do since the morning she stood in the lawyer's office in Harlan County and understood that the papers were real, and the loss was real, and the man across the desk was not going to help her. She sat in the cold grass and fell apart quietly, because she had never been a woman who fell apart loudly, and some habits survive everything. After a while, she noticed the bushes. They were dark-berried, growing in a cluster near a dry creek bed, the kind of plant she had learned to identify years ago when she was a girl, and her father had taught her the difference between what the land offered and what it threatened. She had not forgotten. She knew exactly what those berries were. She did not move toward them immediately. She sat for a long time first. She thought about her husband, Thomas, who had been a decent man and a poor businessman and who had died owing more than anyone had known, leaving her with a boarding house that was technically already collateral on debts she hadn't known existed. She thought about her sister in Ohio, who had written a letter 6 months ago that began, "I don't know how much longer we can," and trailed off into practical reasons why Clara couldn't come east. She thought about the three towns, the landlady in the first who had said we don't take women alone, the foreman in the second who had offered her work, and then changed the nature of the offer when she was already 2 days' walk from anywhere else, and the sheriff in the third who had been kind but helpless and had given her $1 from his own pocket that she had spent on bread before she reached the edge of that town's territory. She stood up and walked to the bushes. She had the berries in her hand. She had already closed her fingers around them, when the sound of hoofbeats registered. She did not look up. She did not think the hoofbeats had anything to do with her because very few things in recent months had anything to do with her, and the world had made clear that her presence in it was a matter of indifference. The horse stopped. She still didn't look up. "Drop those." The voice was not gentle. It was not the voice of a man making a request. It had the flat, used quality of someone who spent more time giving instructions to animals than to people, and had forgotten, if he had ever known, how to soften an order into an invitation. Clara looked up. The man on the horse was somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been worked on by weather and time, and possibly by something harder than either. He was not a large man, but he sat in the saddle with the settled weight of someone who had been on horseback long enough that the horse had become an extension of how he moved through the world. He was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, and was not horror, and was not the particular careful blankness people produce when they have decided to pretend they don't see something. He was looking at her the way you look at a fence post that's leaning at a dangerous angle, with the assessment of someone who is already calculating what the repair will cost. "I said drop them." "You don't have any say in what I do," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "And I don't know you." "Wyatt Callahan. My land starts about 50 yards that direction." He jerked his chin east. "You're close enough." "Then I'll walk further west." He swung down from the horse in a single motion and crossed the distance between them before she had finished the sentence. He didn't grab her hand. He knocked the berries out of it with the back of his wrist, a sharp, practiced motion, the kind you use to knock a tool out of someone's hand before they hurt themselves with it. And then he stepped back immediately, putting distance between them, again, as though he understood that proximity would be unwelcome. The berries scattered in the grass. Clara stared at where they had fallen. Then she felt something that surprised her with its intensity. She was furious, not frightened, not grateful, not relieved. Furious. The anger came up from somewhere deep and cold, and it was not entirely about the berries or the man in front of her. It was the accumulated fury of every door that had closed, and every voice that had said no, and every room that had decided she wasn't worth the trouble. And it landed on Wyatt Callahan because he was the nearest available target, and because he had just taken something from her. "You had no right," she said. "No," he agreed. He said it like a man who has been wrong before, and has learned to just acknowledge it without making a performance out of the admission. "I didn't." That stopped her. She had been ready for an argument. She had been ready for justifications, for the particular kind of speech that men gave when they wanted credit for intervening in something they didn't fully understand. She was not ready for simple agreement delivered without embellishment. "Then why?" she said. Wyatt picked up his horse's reins and didn't answer immediately. He had the look of a man who was working through something, not dramatically, but with the practical concentration of someone who is trying to solve a problem that doesn't have an obvious solution. "Because I needed a cook," he said finally. She stared at him. "My cook quit 3 weeks ago. Before that, I had a man who called himself a cook, but couldn't produce a meal that didn't make half the hands sick. I've got 11 men on my payroll and a ranch that's already in more trouble than I want to think about, and watching them eat what they've been eating is making everything worse." He looked at her with the same assessing expression he'd had on the horse. "You've got hands that know what work is. You've got a face that's seen hard seasons and kept moving, and you are standing next to the most valuable patch of medicinal ground in this county, which means you know plants, which means you know food. You can tell all of that from looking at me." "I can tell most of it, the rest I'm guessing." "What if you're wrong? Then you'll have had a warm meal and a roof for one night, and we'll both know where we stand." He gathered the reins more firmly. "What's your name?" She almost didn't tell him. There was a part of her, the part that had been ground down by months of people using her name and then closing doors in her face, that wanted to refuse even this small piece of herself. "Clara Whitmore," she said. He nodded as though this was a satisfactory piece of information. "The offer is cook's wages, board included. If your cooking is what I think it might be, we discuss the rate after a week. If it isn't, you've still got a week of meals and shelter, and I'll give you the dollar for your trouble." Clara looked at the grass where the berries had fallen. She thought about what it meant to accept something from someone who had not asked permission before deciding to intervene in her life. She thought about the boarding house kitchen she had run for 11 years, the way she had managed suppliers and kept accounts, and fed 20 men at a stretch during harvest seasons when every farm family in Harlan County needed workers housed and fed. She thought about the 3 towns. "One condition," she said. Wyatt waited. "I earn my place through the work, not through anyone feeling sorry for me. If I can't do the job, I go. If I can, you treat me like someone who can do the job." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had heard this particular kind of demand before and respected it more than the other kind. "That's the same deal I offer everyone I hire," he said. "Then we understand each other." She followed him back to the road. Her feet still hurt. The sky was still enormous. But she was walking forward, which was different from where she had been 20 minutes ago. And different mattered even when it was only different by a small degree. The Callahan Ranch was 2 hours north, and Wyatt did not try to make conversation during the ride. Clara sat behind him on the horse and watched the landscape change, the flat grass giving way to rougher ground, to gullies and scrub oak, and the occasional dark line of a creek bed, and thought about what she was walking into, not with hope. She had spent hope on 3 towns already, and she was out of it. She thought about it practically, the way you think about a difficult task you have nonetheless decided to undertake. She had run a kitchen under worse circumstances than unknown. She had managed suppliers who were dishonest, and workers who were unreliable, and a husband who had made financial decisions that she was not always told about until they had already become her problem. She knew how to do the job. That was not the question. The question was whether the job would be allowed to exist without someone deciding in advance that it couldn't. The ranch came into view as the light was beginning to go orange. It was not an impressive spread. The main house was solid enough, 2 stories, unpainted, with a long porch that ran the width of the front, but the outbuildings had the neglected look of a property that had been managed by someone who was fighting fires rather than building anything. Fences at odd angles. A barn with a lean to its roof that suggested its foundation had been settling longer than anyone had addressed it. 2 horses in a paddock that needed repair. But it was there. It was standing. It was not, by the look of it, entirely surrendered to its own deterioration. Several men were visible near the barn as Wyatt rode in. They noticed the woman behind him with exactly the expressions Clara had expected. Not hostility, not immediately, but the studied blankness of men who had formed an opinion before any information was available to form it from. She had seen that look in every room she had entered in the past 8 months. She was fluent in what it meant. It meant she would have to prove herself to people who had already decided their conclusion. She was tired of it, but tired and finished were different conditions, and she had just demonstrated, even to herself, that she understood the difference. She climbed down from the horse without waiting for assistance. Her legs were stiff, and her boots scraped the frozen ground, and she stumbled slightly on the landing, catching herself with one hand against the horse's flank. She straightened, brushed her hand against her skirt, and looked at the men by the barn with an expression that said she had noted them and was not particularly concerned about what they thought. "Where's the kitchen?" she asked Wyatt. He pointed at the house without ceremony. She picked up the bag she'd had tied to her back for the last 2 months. A bag that contained a change of clothes, a small knife, a tin cup, and a worn receipt book she had kept from the boarding house because she couldn't bear to leave it, and walked toward the house. Behind her, she heard one of the hands say something she couldn't entirely catch. Another laughed. Wyatt's voice came back, flat and decisive, and the laughter stopped. Clara did not look back. The kitchen was worse than she had expected. She stood in the doorway for a long moment and took inventory. The stove had a cracked firebox door held shut with wire. The work table was warped badly enough that nothing would sit level on it. 3 sacks of flour sat open, and 2 of them had evidence of moisture damage around the base. The iron pots hanging on the wall were coated with a residue that suggested they hadn't been properly seasoned in years. The window was cracked, and someone had stuffed a piece of sacking in the gap, but the cold still came in around it. She could work with this. She had worked with worse. She set her bag on the cleanest corner of the table and found a lamp. She lit it. Then she started going through every cabinet and shelf and corner of that kitchen, with the systematic attention of someone who is mapping enemy territory. Not with despair, but with the particular sharp focus that comes from understanding that the situation is bad, and that understanding it completely is the first step toward making it less bad. She found 2 intact pots of reasonable quality buried under broken equipment at the back of the lower cabinet, half a barrel of salt pork that was still good, a box of dried beans, cornmeal in a sealed tin, a knife block with 2 knives that could be salvaged with sharpening, lard in quantity, a bag of onions that were past their best days but not yet gone. She could make something from this. Not something fine, something adequate, something that would serve the immediate purpose of feeding 11 men who had been eating poorly and who needed to understand before anything else happened that the situation in the kitchen had changed. She built a fire in the stove. The cracked door smoked, but she angled the damper until the draw corrected most of it. She put the intact pots to heat. She found the sharpening stone in a drawer and worked the 2 good knives until their edges were right. She peeled onions and her eyes watered, and she let them water because she was the only one in the kitchen and there was no one to perform composure for. By the time the hands came in from their evening work, she had salt pork and beans and cornbread ready, and she had found enough of a base to make a gravy that was not fancy, but was hot and thick and tasted like food made by someone who knew what they were doing. She stood at the stove and served without comment. She watched them eat. The man nearest the door, young, with the kind of face that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to look like yet, took 1 bite, stopped, and looked at his bowl with an expression that had nothing performative in it, just surprise. The kind of surprise you have when something exceeds an expectation you hadn't known you were carrying. Nobody said anything. That was fine. She wasn't looking for compliments. But the silence was a different kind of silence than the one she had walked through in 3 towns. This was the silence of 11 men eating with full attention, the way men eat when the food is worth eating, and that was information. Wyatt ate last, standing near the door. He finished his bowl, looked across the kitchen at Clara, and gave her a single nod. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't the speech she might have wanted in another life, in a version of events where she had the luxury of wanting things. It was acknowledgement. It said, "You said you could do this, and you did it, and that matters." Clara stacked the first empty bowls and started water heating for washing. She had a roof. She had a stove, broken as it was. She had work to do, and she had the skills to do it, and that was more than she had standing in the cold grass 2 hours ago. It wasn't hope, but it was solid ground, and solid ground was something she knew how to stand on. She would figure out the rest later. What she didn't know yet, what none of them knew as they ate that first meal in relative silence, and the cold settled around the ranch like a hand pressing down, was that the trouble she had walked into was not the manageable kind. It had a name. It had resources and patience and a particular talent for making destruction look like bad luck. And it was already watching. Clara had been on the Callahan Ranch for 4 days before she fully understood the scale of what she had walked into. The first morning, she had woken before anyone else and spent an hour examining the kitchen by lamplight, making a proper list of what was salvageable and what was not. The cracked firebox door was the most urgent problem. The smoke it produced was not dangerous in the outdoor sense, but it added a sooty undertone to everything cooked near it, and soot was not a flavor she intended to serve. She found a length of flat iron in the tool shed that was close enough engaged to fabricate a temporary patch, and she spent the better part of that first morning working it into shape with a hammer she borrowed from the barn without asking. She asked forgiveness later, not permission, because permission required finding Wyatt, and finding Wyatt required stopping what she was doing, and stopping was not something she was prepared to do while there was still daylight and a broken stove between her and a functional kitchen. The patch was not elegant. It held. By the second day, she had reorganized the pantry entirely, rotating stock by age, discarding what was genuinely lost, and making a written list of what needed to be purchased or traded for at the next supply run. She posted the list on a nail beside the pantry door with a note that said, "In her clearest hand, these items are needed. Substitutions must be discussed before purchasing." She did not ask whether posting lists was acceptable. She simply posted it. By the third day, the hands had stopped looking at her with that particular evaluating blankness. They had not replaced it with warmth. That was not how it worked with men like these, men whose affection traveled through indirection and was expressed primarily through not complaining. But they had replaced it with a kind of watchful neutrality that was, in its own way, a beginning. It was on the fourth morning that she found the account books. She had not been looking for them. She had been searching the back room off the kitchen, a storage room that smelled of old rope and damp wood. For a second lamp she'd been told was somewhere in the house, and she had found instead a wooden crate tucked behind a broken rocking chair with 3 ledgers stacked inside it. The crate was not locked. She picked up the top ledger and opened it, and what she saw in the first several pages made her stand very still for a long moment. She put the ledger back. She found the lamp. She went back to the kitchen and started breakfast, because breakfast was immediate, and the ledgers were a problem she needed to think about before she decided what to do with them. The morning she discovered the books, Holt Greer arrived. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the porch boards with the deliberate weight of a man who wanted to be heard before he was seen, then a knock that was more announcement than request. Clara was turning cornbread in the pan when one of the younger hands, a boy named Pete, who had the unfortunate habit of speaking before he thought, stuck his head into the kitchen and said, "Man here wants Mr. Callahan, says he's from the land office." She looked up. "Is Mr. Callahan at the barn?" "He was. Don't know if he's still." "Then go find out." She turned back to the cornbread. "And don't let whoever it is stand on the porch in the cold. That's not how we do things." Pete disappeared. Clara heard the front door open and a voice in the front room that she didn't recognize. Smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had said whatever he was saying many times before and had refined it down to something that sounded reasonable, even when it wasn't. She finished the cornbread and put it on the table. Then she found a reason to carry a pot of coffee to the front room. The man was somewhere in his 50s, well-dressed for this part of the territory, with the kind of mustache that required daily maintenance and the expression of someone who had trained himself to look pleasant while communicating something else entirely. He was standing near the front window, which put him with his back to the light, and Wyatt at a disadvantage facing it. A small thing, but the kind of small thing a man learns to do if he does it often enough. "Mrs." He looked at Clara with polite inquiry as she set the coffee down. "The cook," she said. She did not offer her name. He turned back to Wyatt with the fluent ease of a man who was accustomed to dismissing women from his calculations without appearing to do so. "As I was saying, Mr. Callahan, the offer is genuinely fair given current land values in this county. Mr. Vane has purchased 3 other properties in the last year at similar terms, and the sellers have all—" "I'm not selling," Wyatt said. He said it the same way he said most things, without drama, without hostility, with the flat finality of someone who had already had this conversation and seen no reason why having it again would produce different results. Holt Greer smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that had been built to absorb refusals and keep moving. "Of course, I'm simply here to ensure you've considered—" "I've considered." Wyatt looked at him with the same assessing stillness he'd turned on Clara in that field 4 days ago. "Is there something else?" There was a pause. Greer's eyes moved, just briefly, just once, to the window, to the yard outside, to the barn and the fencing and the layout of the property, and Clara watched him do it because she was standing in a position he had already decided was irrelevant, which meant he had stopped accounting for her. "No," Greer said pleasantly. "I'll let Mr. Vane know of your position." After he left, Wyatt stood at the window and watched the man's horse until it was out of sight. Clara poured him a cup of coffee and set it on the table near him without comment. He didn't pick it up immediately. "Third time this season," he said, more to himself than to her. "The offer or the visitor?" He looked at her. "Both." She considered whether this was the moment to mention the account books. She decided it wasn't, not yet. She needed to understand what she had seen before she started asking questions about it. "Who is Marcus Vane?" she asked. Wyatt's expression didn't change significantly, but something behind it did. A tightening, a guardedness that was different from his usual reserve. "Land investor, owns property north of Caldwell Flats and most of the water rights east of the Brennan Creek Junction." "Most," Clara said. "Your creek runs through the south pasture." Wyatt picked up the coffee. "He doesn't own that stretch. Yet." "And if he did?" "Then he'd own the water for half this county, and every ranch between here and the county line would have to negotiate with him to keep their cattle alive through summer." He drank the coffee. It was not a comfortable silence. "This particular piece of ground is the one that makes the difference." Clara went back to the kitchen. She thought about the ledgers. She thought about what it meant when a man with enough money to buy water rights was making offers on the one property that stood between him and complete control of a resource that everything else depended on. She thought about the pattern she had begun to see in the accounts. Payments to suppliers she couldn't identify. Withdrawals that corresponded to dates when work should have been happening, but when, by the evidence of the ranch's current condition, nothing productive had been done. She did not say anything that morning. She served breakfast and washed the dishes and sharpened the knives she hadn't finished with the day before. But she pulled the ledgers out after supper and carried them to her room, and she worked through them by lamplight until she couldn't keep her eyes open. And what she found as she worked kept her from falling asleep easily even after she put them down. The first incident happened on the fifth night. Clara woke to the smell of smoke. It was not the kitchen smoke, not the particular quality of wood stove smoke that she had already cataloged and learned to read. This was sharper, with a resinous undertone that said hay or dry wood or both. She was out of bed and at the window before she was fully awake, and what she saw in the yard was a line of orange light at the base of the east fence near the hay storage. She did not waste time. She pulled on her boots and coat and went out the back door and through the yard to the well and started working the pump, and she was filling the first bucket before anyone else had appeared, which told her something about how accustomed these men had become to trouble arriving at unexpected hours. Because when Pete and a hand named Dunmore came running from the bunkhouse 2 minutes later, they moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had drilled this or lived it before. They contained it. The haystack was damaged, but the fence held and the fire didn't reach the barn. In the ordinary sense, it was a manageable disaster. But Clara stood in the yard after and looked at the burn pattern. The careful way the fire had started at ground level in 2 separate spots, the way both spots were against the fence in locations where wind would have driven the fire toward the barn, and understood that this was not an accident. She said nothing. She went inside and put water on for coffee, because it was 3 in the morning and no one was going to sleep again soon, and coffee was something she could do that was useful. Wyatt came in from the yard with his face closed down tight. He sat at the kitchen table and she put a cup in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it and said nothing for a long time. "That's the second time this season," he finally said. "What was the first?" "Section of north fence cut in September. Lost 8 head before we found where they'd gone through." He turned the cup in his hands. Before that, a supplier who backed out of a grain contract 2 weeks before harvest. No explanation, just a letter saying the arrangement was no longer convenient. Clara sat down across from him. She did not do it the way a woman sits when she is being careful. She sat the way she sat at her own table, squarely, with her elbows on the wood. "I found your account books," she said. He looked at her. "In the back room. I wasn't searching for them. I was looking for the spare lamp." She kept her eyes on his. "I looked through them." "You—" He stopped. Something worked through his expression, the beginning of anger, then a reassessment, then something quieter. "And? And there are payment records that don't correspond to any work I can identify on this property. 11 payments over 2 years, each one to a different name, each one for a sum that's significant but not large enough to stand out on its own. They're spread across the ledger in a way that suggests someone was trying to make them look like routine expenses." She paused. "Someone who had access to your books and your money and enough familiarity with your operation to know what routine expenses looked like." Wyatt stared at her. "You got all of that from one night with the books." "I ran a boarding house for 11 years. The books were the only part of the business my husband couldn't undermine without my noticing, because I kept them myself." She said it without bitterness, just as fact. "I know what legitimate accounts look like, and I know what they look like when someone is trying to hide something inside them." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, she could hear Pete and Dunmore talking in low voices near the well. "Hank Pruitt kept the books," Wyatt said finally. "He was my ranch manager for 3 years. Left in the spring, said he was going to his sister's place in Colorado." "Did you verify that?" The look on his face answered the question. "There's something else," Clara said. "The payment amounts. When I added them up, not individually, but together, they're just under the threshold your county uses for mandatory financial disclosure. Whoever structured these payments knew that threshold and stayed below it deliberately." Wyatt set down the coffee cup. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, and she saw in that gesture something she had not seen from him before. Not defeat, but exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting on multiple fronts and is only now beginning to understand how many fronts there actually were. "Vain," he said. "I don't know that. Not from the books alone." She chose her words carefully. But whoever it was had resources, patience, and very detailed knowledge of how your operation functioned. Same thing. Maybe. She stood and refilled his cup. But we need evidence that connects the payments to a person, not just evidence that payments were made. The first only tells you that something wrong happened. The second tells you who you can hold responsible for it. He looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who is recalculating a set of assumptions and finding that the results don't match what they had originally expected. "You're not just a cook," he said. "No," Clara said. "But I'm also a cook. And it's nearly 4 in the morning, and your men are going to need breakfast in 3 hours, so I suggest you get some sleep, and we continue this conversation tomorrow." He left. She sat at the table alone for a while and thought about what she had said and what it meant that she had said it. 8 months ago, she would have thought very carefully before laying out an analysis of financial irregularities to a man she'd known for 4 days. She would have worried about overstepping. She would have softened it, qualified it, made herself smaller inside the information so that it landed without threatening anyone's sense of who was supposed to be in charge. She was tired of making herself smaller. She had done it all her life, and it hadn't protected her from anything. The next 2 weeks moved in a rhythm that was harder than anything Clara had done in recent memory, and more satisfying in ways she couldn't quite account for. The kitchen was becoming what she needed it to be. Not perfect, not what she would have designed from scratch, but functional in a way that produced real results. She had negotiated a supply arrangement with a trading post 15 miles east, convincing the owner that consistent large orders were worth a better price than he was accustomed to offering. She had organized the hands into a rotation for collecting eggs and checking the root cellar, not because she needed the help, but because it connected the men to the daily maintenance of their own sustenance in a way that made them more invested in not wasting it. It was smaller than it sounds, but the small things were what she knew how to do. What she had not expected was Dunmore. He was the hand she had noticed least in the beginning. A quiet man in his 30s, not unfriendly but not forthcoming, who ate steadily and said little and did his work with the methodical reliability of someone who had learned early that reliability was the best protection against being noticed. He had a habit of positioning himself where he could see the most without being seen himself, at the far end of the table, near the door, with a sightline to the yard. She had catalogued this without attaching meaning to it, because observant people came in all varieties, and not all of them were doing anything with what they observed. But on the 12th day, she noticed him talking to Pete near the water trough, and the conversation stopped when she passed within earshot. And on the 14th day, she saw him from the kitchen window riding east at a time when his work for the afternoon should have kept him in the south pasture. She did not say anything to Wyatt, not yet. Instead, she started paying attention to the timing. The fire had happened 2 days after Greer's visit. The cut fencing in September, she had gotten the date from Wyatt in one of their late evening conversations, which had become, without either of them formally deciding this, a regular occurrence, had happened 4 days after Wyatt had turned away a different representative from Vane's office. There was a pattern in it, a communication loop between the ranch and whoever was applying pressure from the outside. The question was where the communication was originating. She added what she knew about Dunmore to the notes she was keeping in the back pages of her receipt book, written in a shorthand that would have been illegible to anyone who hadn't spent years developing it to keep her boarding house accounts private from suppliers who had a habit of checking her books when she wasn't looking. The notes didn't yet add up to certainty, but they added up to a pattern, and patterns were what she knew how to read. The second incident happened on a Saturday. 4 head of cattle were found dead in the south pasture, not from disease, not from the cold, but from something that Wyatt's most experienced hand, a weathered man named Burl who'd worked cattle for 30 years, said he had only seen twice before, and both times it had been deliberate. There was no good reason for 4 animals to be dead in that specific location without any sign of the distress that preceded natural death. Wyatt lost something when he saw them. It was not visible to anyone who didn't know how to look, but Clara had been watching him for 2 weeks and she saw it. A fracture in the composure, a moment where the weight of everything became briefly visible on his face before he locked it back down. He called a meeting of the hands that evening in the barn. Clara was not invited. She stayed in the kitchen, which was adjacent to the barn wall, and could not hear the words but could hear the rhythm and volume of the conversation. And what she heard told her that Wyatt was trying to hold men together who were beginning to consider that the job was not worth the trouble it was bringing. She put together the best meal she had produced since arriving. It was not a calculation of sentiment, it was a practical decision. Men who had eaten well made different choices than men who had eaten poorly, and the choice she needed them to make that evening was to stay. When they came in from the barn, the kitchen was warm and the table was full, and the smell of it hit them at the door in a way that, she had learned by now, was one of the only things that reliably broke through the particular armoring that frontiermen built around themselves. Pete sat down and looked at his plate and said, in a voice that had more of a boy in it than he usually allowed, "This is the best thing I've eaten since my mother's kitchen." "Eat it before it gets cold," Clara said from the stove. Burl, who had never spoken directly to her, looked across the table at her as he picked up his fork and said, "You're good at this." "Yes," she said. "I am." It was not humility, it was not boasting. It was the plain statement of a fact she had worked for, and Burl nodded at it like a man receiving confirmation of something he had already concluded. Wyatt watched this from the doorway. She did not look at him directly, but she knew the moment he made his decision. She heard it in the quality of his silence, the way it shifted from uncertain to resolved. After the men finished and drifted out, he stayed. She was washing the pots. He sat at the table with the same posture she had seen the night of the fire, elbows on the wood, hands around a cooling cup. "Two of the men are talking about leaving," he said. "Not Burl, not Pete, but two of the others." "Did you ask them to stay?" "I told them the situation." "That's not the same thing." She set a pot on the drying rack. "Did you tell them why you're not selling?" He was quiet. "They need to know what they're staying for," she said. "Not what they're staying against. There's a difference." He turned the cup in his hands. "This land was my father's. Before that it was territory that nobody thought was worth anything, and he spent 15 years making something out of it." He said it quietly, without the cadence of someone delivering a speech. Just facts, placed one after another. "He didn't leave it to me to sell it to the first man with enough money to make the paperwork look legitimate." "Then tell them that." "Men don't. Men stay for things that matter to someone." She turned to face him. "They know the land is under pressure. They don't know if you care enough about it to fight for it, or if you're just too stubborn to take the money. Those are different things to work for." He looked at her for a long moment. In the lamplight, his face had the worn quality of something that had been in use for a long time and had held up, not because it was invulnerable, but because it was made of the right materials. "You're very direct," he said. "I spent 8 months not being direct and lost everything I had. I find I'm less interested in being careful about how I say things than I used to be." Something shifted in his expression then. Not the practical assessment she had seen in him before, but something more personal. The particular look of a man who is recognizing something in another person that he had not anticipated recognizing. He stood up. "I'll talk to them," he said. He picked up his coat. "The books. I want to go through them with you tomorrow, if you're willing." "After breakfast," she said. He left. She finished the dishes and damped the stove and sat for a moment at the table in the cooling kitchen and let herself feel, briefly and without elaboration, the strange quality of being somewhere that was beginning to feel less foreign. Not safe, not home, but less foreign. It was on the following Tuesday that she confirmed what she suspected about Dunmore. She had risen early and gone to start the kitchen fire, and in doing so, she had passed the window that looked out onto the east side of the yard, and she had seen him. I was at the fence line, not working, standing, talking to a man on the other side of the fence who Clara did not recognize. She could not hear the conversation. She watched for 2 minutes, and what she saw in those 2 minutes was Dunmore accepting something, a folded paper or a small parcel. She couldn't be certain from the distance, and turning back toward the bunkhouse with the walk of a man trying to look like he had just been taking a morning constitutional. She stood at the window and breathed slowly. She had suspected it. Suspecting it and confirming it were different weights to carry, and she carried the new weight for the rest of the morning without showing it. She made breakfast. She served it. She watched Dunmore eat with the same steady, unreadable face she had catalogued on the first day, and she understood now what she was actually seeing. Not quiet reliability, but the practiced blankness of a man who had been trained to be unobtrusive because unobtrusive was necessary to what he was actually doing on this ranch. After breakfast, while the hands dispersed to their morning work, she caught Wyatt on his way out and said quietly, "Don't send Dunmore to the south fence today." Wyatt stopped. "Find him something to do near the house. I need him visible." He looked at her for a moment. "Clara, I'll explain tonight, after supper." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he went back inside and found Dunmore, and reassigned his work for the day without explanation, which was his right as the man who signed the wages, and Dunmore accepted it with the same unreadable face. That evening, Clara laid out what she had seen and what she had noted in the weeks before it. She placed her receipt book on the table between herself and Wyatt and walked him through the shorthand notes, the timing patterns, the incident dates, the positioning she had observed, and the exchange she had witnessed that morning. Wyatt listened without interrupting. This was something she had come to understand about him. He did not interrupt, not because he was passive, but because he was genuinely processing. He was a man who thought before he responded, and the pause between hearing and answering was not hesitation but work. When she finished, he sat back. "If you're right," he said, "I know." "What do you want to do?" It was the right question. Not what do you think we should do, not what would you suggest. What do you want to do? She noted it and felt something shift because of it. "I want to give him something to report," she said. "Something specific enough that it looks real and important enough that Vane will act on it. And then I want to be ready when they act." Wyatt looked at her across the table. Outside, the wind had picked up and was working at the corners of the house with the determination of something that intended to find a way in regardless. "That's a dangerous plan," he said. "It's a plan," Clara said, "which is more than we have right now." He considered it. She watched him consider it. The weight of the risk against the weight of continuing to absorb losses without being able to fight back. "You'd be putting yourself in the middle of it," he said. "If it goes wrong, if we keep doing what we're doing, it goes wrong anyway, just slower." She met his eyes. "I spent 8 months watching bad things happen to me because I waited for someone else to make the situation better. I'm not doing that again." I was quiet for a long time. "All right," he said finally. Outside, the wind pressed harder against the walls of the house, and somewhere in the dark beyond the yard, something that had been watching and waiting was still there, patient and certain of its advantage, not yet knowing that the calculation had changed. The plan had a shape before it had details, and the details were the hard part. Clara spent 2 days turning it over in her mind the way she turned dough, working it from different angles, testing where it would hold and where it would tear. The broad structure was simple enough. Give Dunmore something to carry back to Vane, something specific and credible, and then be in position when Vane moved on the information. But simple structures had a way of becoming complicated the moment they met actual human beings. And she had learned enough in the past 3 weeks about how this ranch operated to understand that the margin for error was narrower than she would have liked. The first problem was Dunmore himself. He was not a stupid man. She had made the mistake, initially, of filing him under unobtrusive without fully separating that from incurious, and those were not the same thing at all. Over the course of 2 days of careful observation, conducted entirely from within the ordinary routines of kitchen work, because the best way to watch someone without their knowledge was to be somewhere they had already decided was beneath their attention, she recalibrated. Dunmore noticed things. He was quiet about it, but his eyes tracked movement in the yard in the way that a man's eyes track movement when he is keeping account of it, not merely registering it. He would need to believe the information fully. A detail that was too neat, too conveniently available, would make him hesitate, and hesitation would break the chain. The second problem was timing. She had established, through the pattern of the previous incidents, that there was a delay of 2 to 4 days between Dunmore's communication with whoever met him at the fence line and any action taken against the ranch. This suggested a relay. Dunmore to a contact, contact to someone higher, higher to an authorization, authorization back down to action. 4 days was enough time to prepare if she used it correctly. 2 days was not. She needed to know, as precisely as possible, when Dunmore made his report, which meant she needed to manufacture a reason for him to report soon. The third problem was Wyatt. He had agreed to the plan. She did not doubt that, but she had watched him in the days since their conversation, and she could see the tension in the way he held himself. The particular quality of a man who has agreed to something that conflicts with his instincts, and is managing that conflict through force of will rather than resolution. He was not a man who was comfortable with deception as a tool, even tactical deception deployed against people who were actively trying to destroy him. She understood this. She even, in a private way that she did not examine too carefully, respected it. But she also understood that his discomfort could become hesitation at the wrong moment, and she needed to account for that. She talked to him on the third morning, before anyone else was up, with the stove just beginning to warm the kitchen and the sky outside still the gray-purple of pre-dawn. "I need you to tell the hands about a shipment," she said, without preamble, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. Something valuable enough to be worth stealing, but specific enough to be believable. Cattle being moved to market would be the obvious choice. Too obvious. Something that requires paperwork. He looked at her over the cup. "What kind of paperwork?" "Land documentation, deed transfer, survey records. Something that, if removed from the property, would complicate your legal standing on the water rights." She sat down. "Tell the hands you've had a lawyer draw up a comprehensive survey of the South Pasture water access, and that the papers are coming from Caldwell Flats on Friday, that you're keeping them at the house until you can file them properly in the county seat." "That's specific?" "It needs to be specific. Vane doesn't move on vague. He moves on things he can use." Wyatt turned the cup in his hands. "And if Dunmore reports it, they'll try to intercept the papers or take them from the house. Or both. The point is they'll move, and they'll move in a predictable direction." She kept her eyes on his. "I need you to tell the hands this morning, casually, as if it's just business, at the table, where Dunmore can hear." He was quiet for a moment. "What do we actually do on Friday?" "We're ready," she said. "Whatever they try to do. And I think it will be the house, not the road, because the road has too many variables. We're in position to catch them at it." "And Dunmore?" "When whoever comes does what they come to do, we'll have everything we need to connect the chain. Dunmore to the contact to the operation." She paused. "But we need the man who actually comes. We need him to say, in front of witnesses, where he got his information." Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. In the gray morning light, the lines of his face were clear and unsparing, the marks of a life lived in weather and difficulty without sufficient shelter from either. "You've done this before," he said, "not the ranch part, but the thinking through how people move." "I ran a business for 11 years in a town where 3 suppliers regularly tried to cheat me, and 2 of my boarders were in the habit of stealing from each other and blaming the staff," she said. "You learn to think about where things go wrong before they go wrong." He almost smiled. It was a near thing, a shift at the corners of his mouth that didn't quite complete itself, but that she catalogued anyway, because she was becoming fluent in his particular vocabulary of expression, the way she became fluent in any system she spent enough time inside. "All right," he said, "I'll tell them at breakfast." He told them at breakfast. He did it well, casually, as though it was an administrative detail he was sharing because it was relevant to their work, because there would be riders coming to the property on Friday, and the hands should know. He mentioned the survey papers in the same breath as a conversation about the south fence needing attention, which was exactly the right register. Clara served food and did not look at Dunmore directly, and watched him in her peripheral vision the way she had learned to watch things she needed to see without appearing to look. He was still. Too still. The way a man is still when he is making an effort not to react. She noted it. She went back to the stove. That afternoon, Dunmore asked to ride into town for supplies. It was not an unreasonable request. She had sent 2 other hands to the trading post in the past week without incident. But she watched Wyatt's face as he processed it and saw him manage the conflict she had predicted, the impulse to refuse fighting with the understanding that refusing would tip their hand. He said yes. Dunmore left after lunch and came back by dark with a sack of hardware that looked like it had been purchased mostly to justify the trip. The relay had started. The clock was running. Clara used the next 2 days to prepare in every way available to her. She identified the 3 most likely points of entry to the house if someone came at night. She made sure Pete was assigned to the near barn for those nights, which put him within earshot of the house without making his presence look strategic. She had a conversation with Burl that was not entirely about cattle, and that left Burl looking at her with the particular expression of a man who has just been asked to participate in something unusual by someone he has decided he trusts, and who is working through what that means. "You want me at the east corner," Burl said, in the tone of a man clarifying instructions before committing. After midnight, she said. You won't see anything before midnight. Probably not before 2. And the others? Wyatt knows. Pete knows. That's enough. She held his gaze. The fewer who know, the less chance it reaches the wrong ears before Friday. Burl worked his jaw for a moment, chewing something that wasn't there. Dunmore, he said. I don't want to say a name. You don't have to. He looked past her at the yard. I've been watching that man for 2 weeks, and something wasn't right. Couldn't put my finger on it. Thought maybe I was just getting suspicious in my old age. You weren't. No. He looked back at her. All right, East Corner. After midnight. She went back to the kitchen and made supper and tried not to count the hours. Thursday night, she did not sleep. She lay on the narrow cot in her room with her clothes on and listened to the sounds of the house settling and the wind and the distant occasional movement from the barn and the bunkhouse. And she thought about what she was doing and why she was doing it, and whether there was a version of events in which this went badly in a way she hadn't accounted for. There always was. That was the thing about plans. They were structures built in the mind, and the mind, no matter how careful, could only imagine so many versions of what was real. Real had variables you didn't know about until they arrived, but she had spent 8 months doing nothing. Not literally nothing, but nothing of this kind. Nothing that attempted to address the source of the problem rather than its symptoms. And where had that gotten her? She had been careful and patient and practical. And she had still ended up standing in a field with a handful of berries because careful and patient and practical had not been enough. She was done being carefully insufficient. Friday came the way difficult days always came, looking the same as any other day, with the same light and the same cold and the same small morning tasks, unremarkable on their surface. She made breakfast. She sent Pete to the near barn as if it was his regular rotation. She made sure Burl knew what time it was when he finished supper without saying anything that Dunmore could hear. Wyatt caught her eye across the kitchen after the last hand left the table, and she gave him the smallest nod she could manage. He nodded back. Dunmore ate and went to the bunkhouse at his usual hour. The house settled into its evening quiet. Clara stoked the kitchen stove enough to keep a low warmth through the night, banked it carefully, and went to her room. She did not change clothes. At 1:30 in the morning, she heard the sound. It was not dramatic. That was the thing that struck her later when she tried to reconstruct it in her memory. She had expected something louder, more definitive, a sound that announced itself as the moment everything changed. What she heard instead was a small, careful noise, the kind made by someone who was very good at being quiet, but who was working against a door that had a slight resistance in its lower hinge. The back door. She was on her feet and at the wall before she finished processing the sound, flattening herself against it with her back to the wood and her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She waited. She counted seconds by feel, the way she counted bread time when the kitchen clock was unreliable. She heard movement in the hallway, measured, deliberate, the footfall of someone navigating an unfamiliar space in the dark with care. Moving toward the front room where Wyatt's desk was, where any document of importance would logically be kept. She went the other way. She went through the kitchen and out the back door, the same door the intruder had come through, which he had left barely latched because he would need to leave the same way, and around the outside of the house along the north wall to the front porch, where Wyatt was already positioned in the deep shadow at the far end. He had the length of rope. She had said it should be rope, not a weapon, because they needed the man able to talk, and Wyatt had agreed with his mouth while his hands had told a different story, but he'd carried the rope. They waited. The front room window had a reflection problem that she had noticed weeks ago. The angle of the interior lamplight, even when the lamp was turned low, produced a faint illumination visible through the glass from outside, which meant that someone working by feel inside the room would be visible, in silhouette, from the porch. She watched the silhouette move to the desk. Wyatt moved first, and she followed, and what happened in the next 60 seconds was not clean, and it was not the way it worked in the stories she had read as a girl, where men caught criminals with the efficient authority of righteousness. Wyatt went through the front door, and the man inside heard him and made for the back, and Clara was already at the back corner, and they intersected at the kitchen doorway in a collision that was mostly noise and confusion, and the intruder was larger than she had estimated, and there was a moment where he had hold of her forearm with a grip that was going to leave marks. And she did the thing her body did when it had been frightened enough times that fear had stopped producing paralysis, and had started producing something more functional. She drove her elbow back and up and connected with something that produced a satisfying sound of impact and a loosening of the grip. And then Wyatt was there, and Burl was coming through the back door, and Pete was shouting from the yard, and it was over. It was not clean. Her arm hurt. The man they had caught was bleeding from a cut above his eye that she did not think she had caused. I was sitting on this kitchen floor with Burl standing over him, and his hands behind his back with Wyatt's rope around his wrists. And he was breathing hard through his nose and looking at Clara with an expression that had several things in it, none of them simple. She looked back at him. She was breathing hard too. "Who sent you?" Wyatt said. The man on the floor said nothing. "We have your entry point," Clara said, steadying her voice. "We have 4 witnesses. We have the date and the time and what you were in the process of taking." She kept her eyes on him. "The only variable is whether you're the man who acted alone or the man who was following instructions. Courts in this county treat those differently." He looked at her. "Marcus Vane," she said. Not a question. An offering. The name laid on the table like a card, inviting him to confirm it or correct it, both of which told her something. He confirmed it. Not immediately. He sat on the floor for another 40 seconds, which was long enough for Burl to shift his weight, and long enough for Pete to come in from the yard, and long enough for the reality of the situation to settle around the man like weather. Then he said, "I want it on record I was hired. I wasn't working my own plan." "Hired by who?" Wyatt said. "Greer. Holt Greer. He set the jobs, paid the money." He looked at the floor. "Vane never puts his name on it directly. That's how he works. Greer's the layer." Clara looked at Wyatt. He was looking at the man on the floor with an expression that was beyond anger. The particular controlled quality of a man who is hearing confirmed what he has feared for a long time and is deciding, in real time, what to do with the confirmation. "Dunmore," Wyatt said. The man on the floor shrugged, which was its own answer. "The fires," Clara said. "The cattle." "Not me personally. There's a crew. Different people for different work." He raised his eyes to her. "You're the one who figured it out. Greer said there was someone new at the ranch who was asking questions, said it made Vane nervous." She absorbed this. The idea that Marcus Vane, sitting somewhere in a comfortable office with his land deeds and his water rights and his practiced operatives, had been made nervous by a cook asking questions. It would have been satisfying if she'd had more room in her mind for satisfaction. What she had instead was the immediate practical reality of a man tied up on her kitchen floor and a confession that was worth nothing if it wasn't documented. "Can you write?" she asked him. He stared. "I'm going to need you to write down what you've told us. Everything. Who hired you, who paid you, what you were hired to do, what you know about the other incidents on this property." She looked at Wyatt. "And I need you to ride for the county sheriff tonight, not tomorrow, tonight." "It's 2 a.m, Pete said. "Yes," she said. "It is." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. Then he said to Pete, "Saddle the gray." Pete went. She found paper in Wyatt's desk. She found a pen and the ink, and she brought them to the kitchen table, and she sat down across from the man on the floor and waited while Burl helped him upright, and she talked him through what he needed to write the way she had talked Borders through complicated account reconciliations, steadily, without drama, one piece at a time. His name was Callan. He had come to the county 8 months ago. He had worked for Greer's operation. He called it Greer's operation, which was careful of him, but she noted the circumspect framing. For 6 months. He knew the names of 2 other men who had done work on this property. He knew the date of the September fence cutting and the name of the man who had done it. He knew about the 4 head of cattle and said it had been a poison placed in the water source in the south pasture, which was more specific information than Clara had expected, and which told her something about how thoroughly Vane's operation had mapped this ranch's vulnerabilities. She wrote alongside his statement in her own hand, noting details and cross-referencing against what she already knew from the account books, building the kind of layered documentation that was difficult to challenge because it came from multiple sources pointing in the same direction. Wyatt was gone for 4 hours. She kept the kitchen fire going and kept Pete on watch in the yard and made a fresh pot of coffee and gave Callan a cup because he was sitting at her table and she had a physical inability to not feed people who were sitting at her table, which she recognized was an absurd instinct to have in this particular situation and which she gave into anyway. He took the coffee. He held it in both hands, His wrists were still bound, but loosely enough for this, and he looked at her across the table with an expression that had moved past hostility into something more complicated. "You knew about Dunmore for how long?" he said. "About a week. And you waited." "I needed to know where he was reporting. Knowing there was a leak isn't enough if you don't know where it flows." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. "You need the whole channel, not just the crack." He looked at her for a moment. "Greer was right about you." "Greer thought I was asking questions," she said. "He should have thought about what I was doing with the answers." Callan looked at his coffee. "For what it's worth. The woman at the boarding house in Harlan County. The one who had the place transferred." He said it carefully, as if testing whether this was something he could say. She went very still. Vane had 3 other boarding houses in 3 other counties done the same way. Same legal firm, same paperwork, same result. He looked at the table. "I know because I drove the paper to the lawyer for one of them. 2 years ago. Before I understood what I was doing." He stopped. "I understood after. I kept doing it anyway. I'm not telling you that to ask for anything. Just, you should know that it wasn't only you." The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. Clara sat with that information. She had not known, had suspected, but had not known, that her boarding house was one piece of a larger pattern, that the thing that had happened to her had been done with the practiced efficiency of repetition, that there were other women or other people who had stood in rooms that used to be theirs and watched strangers carry out what belonged to them, all of it feeding upward to a man who never put his name on anything. She felt something she did not have an immediate name for. Not just anger, though that was in there. Something larger and colder, the feeling of seeing the actual shape of a thing that you had only seen pieces of before, and understanding that the shape was worse than you had prepared yourself for. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He nodded and looked away. Wyatt returned at 6 in the morning with the county sheriff and a deputy. The sheriff was a man named Aldous Heck, who had the look of someone who had been managing the gap between the law as written and the law as it could actually be enforced in a territory this size for long enough that it had become the defining feature of his professional life. He was not surprised by what he found. That was the telling thing. He was not surprised only by the look of him, resigned in a way that suggested he had been waiting for something like this for some time. He read Colin's written statement. He read Clara's supplementary notes. He looked at the account books, which she had brought from her room and laid out on the table with the relevant entries marked. "This is thorough," he said, looking at Clara. "I've had the books for 2 weeks," she said, "and 11 years of keeping accounts." He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression of someone who is updating his assessment of a situation. Then he looked at Wyatt. "You understand this implicates Greer directly and Vane circumstantially. Getting from circumstantial to actionable on Vane is going to take more than this." "Then we'll get more," Wyatt said. Heck looked back at Callan. "You willing to repeat what's in this statement in front of a county magistrate?" Callan looked at the table, looked at Clara, looked at his coffee cup. "Yes," he said. Heck folded the statement carefully and put it inside his coat. He stood up and his deputy, who had been standing by the door with the expression of someone trying not to look too interested in anything, straightened. "I'm going to need you both available," Heck said to Wyatt and Clara. "This moves forward, it's going to move fast, and there are going to be people who try to slow it down." "We're available," Clara said, before Wyatt could answer. Heck looked at her. A long, considering look, the kind she was accustomed to receiving from men of his age and profession, men who had formed their understanding of what women could do in a particular time and were in the process of encountering evidence that suggested their understanding needed revision. "All right," he said. He settled his hat. "I'll take Mr. Callan with me." They took Callan. They took the written statement. They took a copy of the account entries that Clara had made overnight, because she had made 2 copies of everything, because she was the kind of woman who made copies. When the sheriff's horse was out of sight, Wyatt stood on the porch and the early morning light came across the yard and caught the damage of the past weeks. The still dark mark on the east fence from the fire, the repaired section of barn roof, the physical evidence of a campaign against this place that had been sustained and deliberate and patient. He stood and looked at it for a long time. Clara stood beside him, not close, but beside him. Her arm still ached where Callan had gripped it. She would have a bruise. She was not, at this moment, particularly concerned about it. "Dunmore," Wyatt said. "He'll have heard the sheriff coming. He'll have made a calculation. If he runs, he implicates himself. If he stays, he's caught in Callan's statement." She looked at the bunkhouse. "He's either already gone or he's in there waiting to see what happens next." Wyatt stepped down from the porch and crossed the yard to the bunkhouse. She watched him go. She heard the door open and the sound of voices, and then a longer silence, and then Wyatt's footsteps returning. He came back to the porch and said, "Gone, sometime in the night." "His choice," she said. "It'll look the same in the record either way." He stood beside her again. The morning was getting lighter. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses moved and the boards creaked in response. "Greer doesn't know yet," Wyatt said, "what happened here last night." "No." "And Vane doesn't know." "Not yet." She looked at the fence line, the clear, cold morning, the grass beyond it that went all the way to the horizon. "But they will. And when they do, they're going to have to decide how to respond to it. And we need to be ready for whatever they decide. We need to do more than be ready," she said. "We need to take the story to every family in this county that Vane has pressured or threatened or swindled, and we need them to understand that Callan's statement is a thread that connects to all of them, because Vane can isolate one ranch. He cannot isolate a dozen." Wyatt turned to look at her. "That's not a small thing to organize." "No," she said. "It isn't." She went inside to start breakfast. Her hands were steady. The kitchen was cold, but the stove caught quickly, and the warmth built gradually, the way all real warmth builds. Not all at once, but by accumulation, 1 degree at a time, until the room was transformed from what it had been into something livable. Outside, in an office somewhere with clean floors and expensive furniture, Marcus Vane did not yet know that the careful structure he had built over years was standing on ground that had begun, quietly and with purpose, to shift. The word spread the way bad news always spreads in small territories, faster than anyone planned for and in directions no one fully anticipated. By the time Wyatt rode out 3 days after the sheriff's visit, the story of what had happened at the Callahan Ranch had already reached 4 neighboring properties through the ordinary channels of frontier communication. A hand mentioning something at the trading post, a wife telling a neighbor at the well. The particular speed at which information travels when people have been quietly frightened for a long time and are hungry for evidence that the thing they feared can be named and faced. Wyatt had not orchestrated this. Clara had not orchestrated it either, not directly. But she had understood when she suggested reaching the other affected families that information released into a community finds its own path, and the path it finds is shaped by how ready people are to receive it. The territory was ready. She stayed at the ranch while Wyatt rode the first visits. This was not, she told herself, because she had no standing to accompany him. She had demonstrated by now that her standing on this ranch was not dependent on anyone's permission. It was because the kitchen was what held the daily operation together, and the daily operation was what needed to keep functioning while the larger situation moved forward. The hands still needed to eat. The accounts still needed to be maintained. The supply rotation she had established was, for the first time in months, actually functioning the way it was supposed to, and interrupting it to make calls on neighboring ranches was a way of winning one battle by conceding another. She was practical enough to know when to stay where she was most useful, but she was not idle while she stayed. She had started a second set of records, not the supplementary notes in her receipt book, which were now somewhat famous around the kitchen table since Burl had seen them and told Pete and Pete had told the others, but a formal documentation of every incident she could reconstruct from memory, from her conversations with Wyatt, and from what Callan had revealed in his written statement. She cross-referenced dates, amounts, names, and methods. She organized the account book entries in a sequential timeline rather than a ledger format, which made the pattern of payments visible in a way that a simple column of numbers concealed. She wrote it clearly, in the kind of prose that a county magistrate or a territorial judge could read without needing someone to explain what they were looking at. She was not a lawyer, she knew this, but she had spent 11 years producing documentation precise enough that suppliers who had previously cheated her found it inadvisable to do so once they understood how she kept her books. And she understood that clarity and sequence and the appearance of unassailable order were weapons that functioned in legal settings the same way they functioned in commerce. On the 4th day, Wyatt came back with news. He came in from the barn in the late afternoon and went directly to wash his face and hands, which he always did before coming to the table for anything serious, a habit she had identified early as the equivalent of clearing a workspace before beginning precise work. When he sat down, she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him without being asked. "Brennan family," he said. They had a supplier contract canceled in August with no explanation, right after they turned down an offer. 2 months later, one of their workers was arrested on a charge that Brennan says was manufactured. Vagrancy, of all things, for a man who'd worked the same land for 6 years. And the worker? Eventually released. No formal charges. But the arrest was enough to make 2 other hands quit. He wrapped his hands around the cup. Their operation ran short-handed through the fall. They lost cattle they wouldn't have lost with a full crew. Clara thought about this. Who made the arrest? Deputy out of the East District, name of Fowler. She wrote the name at the top of a blank page. Who else? Hargrove family, up near the Brennan Creek Junction. They've had 3 separate incidents that they thought were bad luck. A drought that hit their well unusually hard, a sickness in their herd that the vet couldn't explain, a fire in their equipment storage in March. The well, she said. He looked at her. If someone has access to the water above your property, if they control the upstream flow, a drought that hits one well unusually hard while the surrounding land holds moisture is not always a natural drought. She looked at the page where she had written Fowler's name. It would take knowledge of the water table, and it would take someone with physical access to the upstream source. Wyatt was very still. Vane owns the water rights to the Brennan Creek headwaters, he said. Yes. They sat with that for a moment. It was one thing to suspect the scope of what Marcus Vane had been doing. It was another to watch the evidence accumulate into something that was no longer a theory, but a documented pattern of deliberate harm, conducted against multiple families over multiple years, using every tool available, including the ones that were supposed to protect people from exactly this kind of thing. Fowler, Wyatt said. Start there. She tapped the name on the page. If the arrest was manufactured, there's a record of it in the district office. Records of who authorized it, who filed the complaint. If Greer or Vane's organization is in that paperwork anywhere, that's not just a civil matter. He looked at her steadily. You know what you're describing? Corruption of a law officer. Yes. She held his gaze. Which is a different category of charge than property damage or financial fraud. Which is why Vane has been careful to keep his name off the operational end of things. Which is also why Callan's statement is more dangerous to him than Vane may currently understand, because Callan named Greer, and Greer's name is almost certainly in that district paperwork. Wyatt sat back. He had the look of a man who is recalculating the odds of a situation and finding them, for the first time in some months, less entirely against him than he had assumed. I need to tell you something, he said. The shift in his tone was specific, not dramatic, but different from the practical register he had been using. She recognized it as the register of something personal. Heck sent word this morning, he said. While you were in the kitchen, one of the deputy's boys brought it out. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and put it on the table. Vane filed a counter-complaint yesterday, against the ranch. She unfolded the paper, read it again. The complaint alleged that Wyatt Callahan had been operating the ranch in violation of a water usage agreement signed in 1879, and that the damages owed under the terms of that agreement, plus interest, totaled an amount that was, she looked at the number twice to make sure she was reading it correctly, more than the assessed value of the ranch itself. She put the paper down. There was no such agreement in 1879, Wyatt said. My father owned this land in 1879. He died in 1881. I have his papers. Do you have them here? In the strongbox under the desk. Get them, she said. He got them. She spent the next 2 hours going through every document in the strongbox, the original land deed, the county registration, 3 seasons of tax records, correspondence with a Caldwell Flats lawyer named Morrow who had handled the estate transfer, and a stack of miscellaneous agreements and receipts that most people would have discarded, but that Wyatt's father had apparently kept from the habit of a man who trusted paper more than memory. There was no water usage agreement, there was no reference to one. There was a correspondence with a water authority office from 1877, 2 years before the alleged agreement, that addressed water rights in terms that directly contradicted what Vane's complaint described. But there was something else. Buried in the miscellaneous stack, She found a document she had to read 3 times before she was certain she understood what she was looking at. It was a transfer of record from the county land office, dated 1880, signed by someone named R. Callahan, Wyatt's father, and countersigned by a land office clerk. The transfer described a 50-foot easement along the south pasture water access. She looked at Wyatt across the table. "Did your father transfer an easement on the south pasture water access in 1880? She asked. "Not that I know of." "Did he ever mention it?" "No." She looked at the signature. She had been looking at documents produced by Wyatt's father for 2 hours. She had a reasonable sense of his handwriting. The particular slope of it, the way he formed his letters, the pressure he applied to the pen. This signature had the right general shape, but something in its formation was off in a way she could not immediately articulate, but could clearly feel, the way you feel a note that is close to right, but not quite right. "This signature may not be your father's," she said. Wyatt came around the table and stood beside her and looked at the document for a long time. "No," he said finally. "That's not his hand. His S had a loop at the bottom. My father wrote his S the same way his whole life." He pointed at the signature. "That one doesn't." They were quiet. "They've had this in reserve," Clara said. "The false water agreement, the fabricated easement. They've been building this for longer than we understood." She looked at the counter complaint paper. "This is not a response to what happened Friday night. This was already prepared. They filed it when they did because someone told them we were moving against them," Wyatt said. "Not Dunmore. He was gone before we had the sheriff's visit." "Before," Wyatt said. He looked at her. "Someone else?" She did not want it to be true. She ran through the people who had known about the sheriff's visit, about Callan's statement, about the account book documentation, Wyatt, herself, Burl, Pete, Heck, and his deputy. She thought about Heck's deputy, who had stood by the door with the expression of someone trying not to look too interested in anything. "What do you know about Heck's deputy?" she asked. "Young, new to the district. Came from the east." He stopped. "Came from the East District, where Fowler works." The kitchen was very quiet. "We can't prove that," she said. "Not yet. And we can't let on that we suspect it, because if we do and we're wrong, we've made an enemy of the sheriff's office at the worst possible time. And if we're right, we've warned them." She folded her hands on the table. "We need to take everything we have directly to the county seat, not through Heck, not through any local channel. That's a 2-day ride. Then we leave tomorrow." He looked at her. "We." She met his gaze without flinching. "You need someone who can present the documentation coherently and answer questions about what it represents. I built most of it. I go." He thought about arguing. She could see him thinking about it. Not from any desire to exclude her, she had understood by now that he was not that kind of man, but from the practical calculation of what it meant to leave the ranch for 2 days when its situation was already precarious. Then he worked through the same calculation she had already worked through and arrived at the same place. "We take Burl," he said. "He stays with the horses and the camp. I don't want you in the county seat without someone who can—" "Wyatt." He stopped. "I appreciate the instinct," she said, "but I've been getting from one place to another without anyone's protection for 8 months. I know how to manage in a situation that isn't friendly." "This isn't about friendly," he said. "This is about Vane having people everywhere we haven't found yet. It's not protection, it's backup." She considered this. It was a different argument than the one she had been prepared to push back against. It was, in fact, a reasonable argument. "Fine," she said. "Burl comes." They left at first light. Clara had spent the evening organizing the documentation into a sequence that could be presented to a county magistrate in under an hour. Everything dated, everything cross-referenced, with a 1-page summary at the front that laid out the core facts in the order a legal proceeding would need to address them. She had made 2 copies. She carried one. Wyatt carried the other, in a different bag, because the same instinct that had made her father keep miscellaneous receipts for 20 years had taught her that the documents that mattered most should never travel as a single point of failure. The road to the county seat ran northeast through country that was open enough in daylight, but that had a different quality in the early morning, gray and vast and indifferent, in the particular way of land that has no investment in the outcomes of the people crossing it. Burl rode ahead. Wyatt rode beside her. The 3 of them did not talk much during the first hours. It was around mid-morning, when the sun had climbed enough to take the edge off the cold, that Burl raised his hand in the signal for stop. Clara had learned Burl's signals over the past weeks. Not formally, not through any conversation about them, but through the simple process of paying attention to how an experienced man communicated when he was trying to communicate without sound. She stopped her horse and looked where he was looking. 2 riders, on the crest of the low ridge to their right, not moving toward them, not moving away, just present. "You know them?" she asked Wyatt quietly. "No. They've been there since before the last bend," Burl said, equally quiet. "I picked them up about a mile back." Clara looked at the riders. They were too far to read clearly, but their positioning had the deliberate quality of people who are where they are because they chose to be there, not because the road happened to bring them. "Vane knows we're moving," she said. "Looks like." "Can we go around the ridge?" "Adds 4 hours," Burl said. "Maybe 5, depending on the creek." She thought about the counter-complaint. She thought about the deputy who had come from the East District. She thought about how much time had already been lost, and how much more they could afford to lose before Vane's legal maneuver became established fact. "We keep going," she said. "Straight through." She looked at Wyatt. "If they move toward us, we don't stop. If they follow, we don't slow down. We reach the county seat, and we file everything before we do anything else." "And if they try to intercept us on the road?" She looked at the riders on the ridge. They had not moved. "Then we deal with that when it happens," she said. "But I'm not giving up 4 hours and the element of timing to avoid something that might not happen." Wyatt looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to know as his version of "you are a very particular kind of person, and I have not finished deciding what to do with that fact." Then he looked at Burl. Burl shrugged. "She's not wrong." They rode on. The riders on the ridge watched them pass and did not follow. She did not let out the breath she had been holding until they were over the next rise and the ridge was behind them, and even then she held her posture steady because the road still had miles on it and the day still had hours. They reached the county seat by late afternoon. The county courthouse was a 2-story stone building that looked like it had been designed with more optimism about the future of the county than the county had subsequently warranted. Large windows, a formal entrance, the architectural confidence of civic ambition. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the particular dry staleness of rooms that were bureaucratic rather than inhabited. The magistrate's clerk was a thin man named Aldrich, who looked at Clara with the automatic register and dismiss that she had learned to absorb and move through without showing that she had noticed. She put the documentation on his desk with a precision that communicated something different from the demeanor he had assigned to her, and she said, "We need to file a formal response to a counter-complaint filed yesterday by a Marcus Vane against the Callahan Ranch. And alongside that response, we need to submit evidence of criminal fraud, property sabotage, and potentially corrupt conduct by a district law officer, all of which connects to the same individual." She paused. "I'd like to do that today, before close of office, so there's a record of the filing date." Aldrich looked at the stack of documentation. He looked at Wyatt. He looked back at Clara. "Are you the attorney of record?" he asked. "I'm the person who built the documentation," she said. "Mr. Callahan is the property owner. He'd like to see the magistrate." The magistrate was a woman named Harriet Flood, which surprised everyone who arrived at the county seat, expecting otherwise, and which Harriet Flood had spent 20 years using as a mild advantage over people who made incorrect assumptions. She was in her 60s with the compressed efficiency of someone who had learned to do twice the work in half the time because the alternative was not getting it done at all. She read Clara's summary page while Clara and Wyatt waited in the chairs across from her desk. She read it twice. She looked up. "This fabricated easement," she said. "You have the original land records from the same period to compare it against?" "Tab 4, Clara said. Flood turned to tab 4. She examined it for a long time. "The signature," she said. "Compared against 6 authenticated signatures from the same period. The formation of the capital S is inconsistent with all of them in a specific and reproducible way." Flood looked at her over the documents. "You're not a lawyer." "No, ma'am." "What are you?" "At present, the cook at the Callahan Ranch." Clara kept her voice steady and her hands still in her lap. "Before that, I ran a boarding house in Harlan County for 11 years. Vane's organization took it from me using the same legal firm that filed yesterday's countercomplaint." Flood was still. "So you have a personal interest in this matter," she said. "Yes," Clara said. I also have 11 years of bookkeeping experience, 2 weeks of detailed analysis of the Callahan accounts, and documentation that connects at least a dozen incidents of property sabotage to a coordinated campaign. She paused. The personal interest and the documentation are both real. I would suggest the documentation stands on its own regardless of the first. Flood looked at her for another long moment. Then she looked at Wyatt. Mr. Callahan, is this woman's account of events accurate to the best of your knowledge? Every word, Wyatt said. Flood set the documents down and folded her hands on the desk. She had the expression of a person who has been waiting for a particular kind of problem to become visible and is now working through the implications of the fact that it finally has. I'm going to need 3 days to examine this properly, she said. I'm going to need to send for the original land records from 1880, and I'm going to need to speak with Sheriff Heck, which I will do in a manner that does not flag the nature of my inquiry to anyone in his office until I have a clearer picture of his deputy's situation. Clara felt something she had not felt in a long time, the sensation of a structure holding, not complete, not finished, not safe yet, but holding, the way a repaired stove holds when the fire takes and the warmth begins to build. There are other families, Clara said, the Brennans, the Hargroves, others that Wyatt has identified in the past week. They have their own accounts of what happened to them, and those accounts will show the same pattern. Get me their statements, Flood said. Written, signed, dated, as many as you can reach in 2 weeks. She stood. Aldrich will give you the formal filing receipts before you leave. The counter-complaint has stayed pending my review, which means the ranch is not under immediate legal threat in the meantime. She looked at the documentation on her desk. This is careful work. Thank you, Clara said. I'm not complimenting you, Flood said, but not unkindly. I'm noting it as a material fact. Careful work is harder to challenge than sloppy work. You understood that when you built this. Yes, Clara said. I did. They filed. They got the receipts. They found Burl at the livery, where he had spent the afternoon in the company of the horses and a deck of cards and his own company, which was the kind of afternoon Burl found entirely satisfactory. He looked at their faces when they came in and read what was there. Well, he said, pocketing the cards, that's better than it could have been. It's a start, Clara said. They stayed the night at a boarding house on the north side of the county seat. Clara noted the quality of the kitchen management the way she noted it everywhere now, professionally and without being able to stop herself, and rode back the following morning. On the way home, Wyatt was quiet for the first hour in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was the quiet of someone who is sitting with a feeling they have not yet found language for. She let him have it. She had learned to let him move through things at the speed they moved through him, which was not always the speed she would have preferred, but which was his and not hers to direct. Around midday, he said, My father built that ranch with 8 years of his life before it became anything worth building. She looked at him. He did it wrong a lot of the time. He wasn't a natural rancher. He was a man who had an idea about land and what it meant to own a piece of it that nobody could take from you, and he worked his idea into something real. He was quiet for another moment. He'd have been stubborn about it in ways that didn't always make sense. I'm stubborn about it in the same ways. I know, she said, what Flood said, about careful work being harder to challenge. He looked at the road ahead. You understood the law better than I did, better than most people I know. I understood the documentation, she said. Those aren't the same thing. Close enough. He glanced at her. Why did you do it? Not the kitchen, not the accounts. I understand the accounts. But the rest. The trap, the statements, this. He gestured vaguely at the road, meaning the county seat, meaning all of it. You could have done the job and stayed out of it. She thought about this honestly. She had asked herself the same question, in the quiet hours when the kitchen was done for the night and the ranch was asleep and she was alone with the lamp and the paperwork. Because Callan told me it wasn't only me, she said finally, the boarding house. There were others done the same way, to other people, by the same operation. She looked at the road. I was angry for a long time about what happened to me, and anger by itself doesn't go anywhere useful. But when I understood the scope of it, when I could see the pattern, and I knew I was one of the only people who had both the documentation and the position to do something with it, she paused. Staying out of it would have felt like a second loss, and I'm tired of losing things. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. "You're not losing anything else," he said. It came out quiet, as though he had not entirely intended to say it out loud. She did not answer immediately. The road went forward between the grass and the sky and the cold afternoon air. "We still have 2 weeks of statements to collect," she said. "I know. And Vane is going to find out what was filed. When he does, he'll adjust. He won't stop." "I know that too." "Then we don't stop either," she said. The ranch appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon, its lines familiar now in a way they had not been a month ago. The barn's slightly uneven roofline, the porch with its warped second board, the east fence still showing the faint scar from the fire. She recognized it. That was the thing she registered as they rode in. Not just the physical shapes, but the recognition, the particular quality of arriving somewhere that your mind has already learned to identify as the place you are returning to. She had not felt that in 8 months. It was not, she told herself, something to make too much of. The situation was still unresolved. Vane was still operational. Flood's review would take 3 days minimum, and the statements from neighboring families would take the better part of 2 weeks. And there were still variables she hadn't accounted for, because there were always variables she hadn't accounted for. But she rode through the gate, and the kitchen window caught the last of the afternoon light, and she was tired in the particular way you are tired when you have done real work and the work has been worth doing, and she thought, this is a place worth fighting for. Not hers. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the way that the boarding house had been hers. Built on her name and her years and the particular accumulation of her own effort. But worth fighting for, which was something she had almost stopped believing anything could be. Pete was at the barn when they rode in. He looked at their faces the same way Burl had the night before. "Good?" he asked. "Getting there," Clara said. She handed her horse to Pete and went inside to start supper, because supper was what came next, and what came next was where she lived, in the immediate and the practical, and the work that could be done with her hands in the hours that were given to her. And in the county seat, in a stone building that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, a woman named Harriet Flood worked by lamplight through documentation that a former boarding house owner had built with 11 years of careful habit and 2 weeks of concentrated purpose. And what she found as she worked through it settled around her with the weight of something that had been a long time coming and had finally, in the way that things eventually do when enough careful work has been aimed at them, arrived. Harriet Flood moved faster than Clara had expected, and Clara had learned by then not to expect things to move fast. The 3 days Flood had estimated became 2, because what she found in the original 1880 land records was not ambiguous. The county archive held the clerk's copy of every easement and transfer filed that year, and the clerk's copy of the document Vane's lawyers had submitted as evidence did not exist. There was no corresponding record. There was no filing date. There was no clerk's countersignature in the archive that matched the one on the document pulled from Wyatt's strongbox, because the document pulled from Wyatt's strongbox had never been filed. It had been fabricated and inserted into the ranch's own records at some point when someone with access to the property had the opportunity to do it. Flood sent word on the second evening. Clara read the note twice standing in the kitchen doorway and then set it on the table and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and breathed. "Good news or bad?" Wyatt said from the doorway. "The easement is confirmed fabricated," she said. "Flood is issuing a formal finding. The counter-complaint is dismissed." He came in and read the note himself. She watched him read it, the way his jaw changed, something releasing that had been held for a long time. "That's one piece," she said. "Vane's lawyers will file something else. We need the family statements before he does." "I know." He set the note down. "Brennan said yes. Hargrove said yes. I got word from 2 other families north of the creek this afternoon while you were working the accounts. A family named Tilson and another named Ware. Both of them had incidents they're willing to document. That's 6, including us. 7. There's a widow south of Caldwell Flats, woman named Elsie Pruitt, who had a water dispute with Vane's operation last spring. Burl knows her. He says she'll talk if someone goes to her." Clara looked at the note again. 6 families, 7, with Elsie Pruitt, each with their own account of what Vane's operation had done to them, each one a thread, and all of them, when pulled together, forming something that was no longer a pattern of isolated incidents, but a documented history of coordinated predation against independent landholders across an entire county. "I'll ride to Pruitt tomorrow," she said. "You coordinate the written statements from the others. Flood needs them within 10 days. Wyatt looked at her. You'll ride alone? Burl will come. She picked up the note and filed it in the documentation stack she kept on the shelf above the kitchen table, precisely ordered and precisely labeled, because disorder in paper was the same as disorder in a kitchen. It created losses you didn't notice until they became catastrophic. Unless you need him here. I'll manage, Wyatt said. She left the next morning before the hands were fully awake, with Burl riding beside her and a saddlebag containing a blank statement form she had drafted the previous evening and a copy of the summary document she had built for Flood, because showing someone what the larger picture looked like was often the thing that helped them understand why their particular piece of it mattered. Elsie Pruitt lived on 12 acres south of town on land that she had been working alone for 4 years, since her husband died of a fever that had come on fast and finished quickly. She was 61 years old, and she was not the kind of woman who answered her door without establishing who was on the other side of it first, which Clara respected immediately. She stood in the doorway with the particular wary self-possession of a person who has been managing their own survival long enough that wariness has become a resource rather than a flaw. Clara told her who she was and why she had come, plainly and without softening it. She did not ask for sympathy, and she did not offer it. She laid out what they had found, what Flood had confirmed, and what the statements were meant to accomplish. Elsie Pruitt listened without interrupting. She had the quality of a woman who had learned that listening completely was more efficient than asking questions before the other person had finished. When Clara was done, Elsie said, "Vane's man offered me 30 cents on the dollar for this land last April. When I said no, my upstream water access was blocked for 3 weeks. He called it a maintenance issue. Will you put that in writing?" Elsie looked at her for a moment. "You're the woman who figured out the cook situation at Callahan's ranch." Clara blinked. "I'm the cook at Callahan's ranch." Word travels. Something shifted in Elsie's face, not quite a smile, but the shadow of one. Word in this county is that a woman nobody knew showed up at that ranch and turned it around, and then turned something else around that was a lot harder. She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll write the statement. I want coffee first." Clara had coffee with Elsie Pruitt and listened to a full accounting of what Vane's water manipulation had cost a woman who had been holding 12 acres together alone for 4 years. And she wrote it down in her clearest hand while Elsie talked. And then Elsie signed it and dated it and looked at Clara across the kitchen table with an expression that was not gratitude exactly, but something related to it. The look of a person who has been waiting to be able to do something about a problem and has finally been given the instrument. "There are others," Elsie said as Clara was preparing to leave, "south of me. A family named Cutler who had their cattle lease terminated without cause in June. And Marge Holloway, who's been fighting a boundary dispute for 8 months that doesn't make sense on any map I've ever seen. Can you reach them?" "I can reach Marge tonight." Elsie held Clara's gaze. "You're building something here. You understand that." "I'm building a case," Clara said. "That's not all you're building." Elsie said it without sentiment as a factual observation. "In this county, people have been alone with what Vane did to them, thinking it was their fault or their bad luck, or that there was nothing to be done. You show them the whole picture and they understand they were never alone. That's—" She stopped. "That matters. Beyond the legal end of it." Clara stood in Elsie's doorway with the signed statement in her bag and thought about what it meant. Not just the document, but the conversation that had produced it, the recognition in Elsie's face when she understood she was not the only one. The particular quality of a burden that shifts when you discover it has been shared all along without your knowing. She thought about standing in a field with her fist closed around something she had almost used, and a stranger on a horse who had knocked it out of her hand without asking permission. She thought about how the thing that had felt like an intrusion had been, in a way she could not have seen at the time, a door. "Thank you for the coffee," she said to Elsie. She and Burl rode back in the long afternoon light. He was quiet the way he was always quiet, not from lack of things to say, but from the preference of a man who had learned that silence was a more accurate currency than speech for most of what mattered. She was grateful for it. "Callahan's a good man," he said eventually, somewhere in the last hour of the ride. She looked at him. "Not a complicated statement," he said. "Just true." She looked at the road ahead. "I know. He doesn't say things twice. When he says a thing, he means it." Burl looked at the horizon. "He hasn't said much about the future, but a man that quiet about the future is usually thinking about it harder than a man who won't stop talking about it." Clara let this sit. She did not encourage it, and she did not discourage it, and she rode the rest of the way back in a quiet that had a different texture than it had on the way out. Over the next 9 days, the statements came together. Wyatt rode 3 properties himself, coming back each evening with signed documents and, occasionally, something additional. A piece of correspondence that a family had kept without understanding its significance. A record of a canceled contract. A letter from Greer's office that referred obliquely to arrangements that made sense now in the context of everything else. Clara added each new piece to the documentation stack, integrating it into the sequential record she was building, cross-referencing and indexing, turning a collection of separate grievances into a single coherent account of how one man's operation had worked and what it had cost the people who had lived inside its reach. On the 8th day, Holt Greer was arrested. The news came through Flood's office, relayed through a writer who brought a formal notice to the ranch. Greer had been taken into custody on charges that included fraud, conspiracy to commit property damage, and corruption of a law officer, the last charge confirmed by Flood's quiet inquiry into the East District deputy, which had produced, with the kind of methodical inevitability that good investigative work produces, a financial connection between the deputy and a shell company that traced back to Vane's holding organization. The deputy had resigned that same morning, which was its own kind of confession. Clara read the notice at the kitchen table with Pete standing over her shoulder trying to read it too, and Burl leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his face doing the thing it did when he was satisfied but not inclined to show it obviously. "Greer," Pete said. "They got Greer." "They got Greer," Clara said. "What about Vane?" She set the notice down. "Vane is careful, he always has been. Getting Greer is the first step, not the last." She looked at the documentation stack. "Everything we've built points to him, but pointing to someone and proving their direct involvement in a criminal operation are different standards, and Vane knows the difference better than most." "So he walks," Pete said, with the bluntness of someone who has not yet learned to separate the immediate disappointment from the larger picture. "Not necessarily," Wyatt said from the doorway. He had come in while they were reading, and none of them had heard him. He was holding a letter, not from Flood's office, from a different seal. He set it on the table beside the notice. Clara looked at it. The seal was from the Territorial Land Commissioner's office. She unfolded it and read it. The Territorial Land Commissioner had received from Magistrate Flood's office a referral regarding irregularities in land and water rights filings across 3 counties, and was opening a formal investigation into the business practices of a holding company associated with Marcus Vane. All existing disputed transactions involving that company were stayed pending the investigation's conclusion. She read it twice. The territorial level. Above the county, above the district. A level of authority that Vane's local connections could not reach. "How did Flood—" she started. "She went above her own authority," Wyatt said. "She said, in the cover letter she sent me, that the scope of what we documented exceeded what a county magistrate had the jurisdiction to fully address, and that referring it upward was the only way to ensure it was handled at the right scale." Clara sat with this. She thought about Harriet Flood working by lamplight in a stone building in the county seat, reading through documentation that a former boarding house owner had built from account books and receipts in a shorthand that nobody else could read. She thought about what it meant for a woman in Flood's position, a woman who had spent 20 years doing twice the work in half the time, to look at that documentation and decide that it deserved the full weight of the authority available to her. "Vane won't be arrested today," she said. "Maybe not this month." "No," Wyatt agreed. "But his operation is frozen. The transactions are stayed. Every piece of land and water rights he's tried to acquire through fraud is now under examination." She looked at the letter. "He can't do to anyone else what he's been doing, not while this investigation is open. And if the investigation is thorough, it will be," Wyatt said. "Flood made sure of that. Then the people he's already hurt have standing to recover what was taken." She looked at him. "The boarding house, the other properties. If the holding company's transactions are investigated, the fraudulent transfers could be reversed." He looked at her steadily. "Including yours." She had been trying not to think about this directly. She had been keeping it at the edge of her consideration because thinking about it directly felt like wanting something before she had any right to want it, and she had learned to be careful with wanting things. "That's a long process," she said. "Even if it goes that way, it's months, maybe longer." "Probably," he said, "but it's possible." Yes. She looked at the letter. It's possible. The 10th day, she finished the documentation package and rode to the county seat with Wyatt to deliver it to Flood's office in person. Aldrich, the thin clerk, had developed by this point a specific kind of efficiency when they arrived. The efficiency of a man who has updated his initial assessment of a situation and adjusted his procedures accordingly. He processed the filing without delay and gave them their receipts and said, with something almost like warmth, "The magistrate said to tell you the commissioner's investigator arrives next week." "Thank you," Clara said. On the ride back, the sky was the particular clear, cold blue that the high plains produced in the weeks before winter fully arrived. Enormous and without sentiment, the sky of a place that did not adjust itself for the people living under it, but that had, she had come to understand, its own severe beauty in the not adjusting. They were an hour from the ranch when Wyatt said, without prelude, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. He looked at the road. He had the expression of a man working through language that did not come naturally to him, not from lack of feeling, but from the particular difficulty of a person who has spent more years communicating with land and animals than with other people. And who knows, when it matters, that the imprecision of the right words spoken plainly is still better than the precision of words not spoken at all. "I don't know what happens with the boarding house," he said. "The investigation could go that way, or it might not. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you I know." "I know you're not," she said. "What I do know is what the ranch looks like now compared to what it looked like a month ago, and I know that most of that difference has a specific cause." He was still looking at the road. "You came here because I didn't give you another option. That's not a thing I'm proud of. But I'm not sorry you came." She waited. "I'm asking if you'd stay." He glanced at her then, briefly, and looked back at the road. "Not because the ranch needs a cook. It does, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if—" He stopped, started again. "I'm asking if there's a reason for you to stay that has nothing to do with what you can do for the operation." Clara looked at the road in front of them. The ranch was visible on the horizon now, its familiar uneven outline, the barn with its slightly settled roof, the porch with its warped second board. She thought about what Elsie Pruitt had said. You're building something here, beyond the legal end of it. She thought about 8 months on roads that went nowhere, about rooms that closed, about 3 towns and a field and a fistful of dark berries. She thought about how the version of herself who had stood in that field would not recognize the version of herself sitting on this horse, not because the pain had been erased. It hadn't. It was still there. It would probably always be somewhere in her, but because pain and purpose had turned out to be things that could occupy the same person at the same time without either canceling the other. She had not come here to find something. She had come here because she had nowhere left to go, and a man she didn't know had made a practical offer. She had stayed because the work needed doing. She had built what she had built because the situation required it, and she had the skills. But somewhere inside all of that, between the account books and the fabricated easement and the kitchen fire and the cold rides and the late evenings at the table with the lamp between them, something else had been building. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in the stories she had read as a girl. Quietly. The way things build when the people involved are too busy and too practical and too scarred to notice until they are already inside it. "The boarding house was mine," she said. "I built it from 11 years of work. If it comes back to me through the investigation, I'll have to decide what I do with it." She paused. "But a building is not the same thing as a place you belong. I lived in that building for 11 years and I belonged to it, but I'm not sure it belonged to me because belonging goes in both directions." He looked at her. "This ranch is yours," she said. "It's your father's work and your stubbornness in your hands. But I've spent a month and a half inside it, and I know where every crack in the stove is and what the east fence looks like before a storm, and how Pete takes his coffee, and when Burl is thinking about something difficult versus when he's just quiet." She looked at him. "I know this place." "Yes," he said. "I'm not asking you for something in return," she said. "I'm not trading one security for another. I tried that kind of calculation for too many years and it didn't protect me from anything." She held his gaze. "I'm saying yes because I want to, because this is a place I want to be, and you are someone I want to be near, and those 2 facts are enough for me to work with." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's the most direct answer I've ever received to a question I barely managed to ask," he said. "I told you I'm done being careful about how I say things." Something moved across his face that was not the near smile she had catalogued before. It was the whole thing, unguarded, the full expression of a man who is allowing himself to feel something he has been managing carefully and who has decided finally that the management is no longer necessary. He said. All right, she said. They rode the last hour back in a quiet that was different from any quiet that had preceded it. Not easier, necessarily. Not without complication or uncertainty or the practical awareness that the things they were navigating, legally, financially, personally, were not finished and would not be finished for some time, but a quiet that had, underneath it, the quality of ground that has been examined and found solid. Winter came to the Callahan Ranch the way it came to that part of the territory, without announcement, arriving one morning as a fact rather than a forecast, the temperature dropping overnight into something that was final rather than merely cold. Clara adjusted the kitchen accordingly. Heavier food, more root vegetables from the cellar, longer cooking times, the sourdough starter she had been maintaining since her second week on the ranch, producing now the dense, dark bread that was what the cold required rather than what the warmer months had permitted. The hands changed as the season changed. Not in character, Pete was still Pete, still speaking before thinking, still occasionally surprising her with the depth of perception that lived underneath the impulsiveness. Burl was still Burl, still carrying his stillness like equipment he had learned to rely on. 2 new hands came on for the winter work, referred by the Brennan family, and Clara assessed them the same way she had assessed everything else on this ranch, directly, without preconception, letting the evidence of what they actually did determine what she thought of them. The investigation moved at the speed of institutional processes, which was slower than the speed of the people waiting on its results. The territorial commissioner's investigator, a man named Gault, methodical and unimpressible, who interviewed Clara for 3 hours over 2 separate sessions and read through her documentation with the practiced attention of a man who had seen a great deal of fraud and recognized the quality of what had been assembled, reported findings in late November that confirmed the fraudulent nature of at least 7 transactions connected to Vane's holding company, including 3 that directly involved the families who had provided statements. Marcus Vane was not arrested in November. He was arrested in December, on a Thursday, in his office in the territorial capital, on charges that included fraud, conspiracy, and criminal corruption of public officials. Holt Greer, who had been in county custody since October, had made a full statement in exchange for reduced charges, and Greer's statement was the bridge between the circumstantial and the actionable that Flood had said they needed. Greer knew where every connection led. He had been Vane's instrument for 11 years, and he turned it all over with the thorough completeness of a man who has decided that loyalty to someone who will discard you is not worth the weight of a prison sentence. When the news reached the ranch, it came through a rider from the county seat with an official notice and a personal note from Harriet Flood that Clara read at the kitchen table with her hands still floury from the morning's breadwork. The note said, in Flood's compressed and efficient hand, "The case will proceed through spring. Your documentation was foundational. The families involved will be contacted directly regarding restitution. I expect the boarding house transfer will be among the reversals reviewed. H. Flood." Clara read it twice. Then she put it down and went back to the bread, because the bread needed another 20 minutes. And 20 minutes was 20 minutes regardless of what else was happening in the world. Pete came in for the mid-morning coffee and found her at the stove and looked at the note on the table and read enough of it to understand the outline. "Vane," he said. "Thursday," she said, "in the Capitol." Pete was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that she looked at him. He had the expression of someone who is feeling something larger than his ordinary emotional vocabulary and is taking a moment to find the right container for it. "When I came to this ranch," he said, "it was because no other outfit would take me. Too young, they said. Too green. Mr. Callahan said he'd try me for a month." He looked at the table. "By the time you got here, I was thinking about leaving. The food was bad and the work felt like we were losing no matter what we did." He looked up at her. "I'm glad I stayed." She looked at him. He was 20 years old and he had not finished becoming who he was going to be, and that was visible in his face, the roughness of it, the places where experience had started to settle but hadn't finished yet. "So am I," she said. She sent him back out with his coffee and went back to the bread and thought about what it meant to be the reason someone stayed somewhere. She had spent her life being the person who stayed. in a marriage that was imperfect, in a business that was hers to keep running regardless of what happened around it, in a county that did not make it easy. She had not understood until recently that staying was a skill, not just a condition. That the capacity to hold your ground through difficulty was something you built, the way you built a sourdough culture, through daily attention, through feeding it even when it seemed like it wasn't doing anything, through patience with the slow work of fermentation that could not be rushed without being ruined. Wyatt told the hands about Vane's arrest at supper that evening. He said it simply, without performance, the same way he said everything. The table was quiet for a moment after he finished, and then Burl said, "About time." And that was essentially the eulogy for Marcus Vane's operation in the household of the Callahan Ranch. After supper, after the dishes, Wyatt and Clara sat at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, the way they had sat through half a dozen evenings that had each changed something. The first time she had shown him the account books, the evening she had laid out what she knew about Dunmore, the night after the sheriff's visit, the night before they rode to the county seat. The lamp was the same lamp. The table was the same table. She had replaced the warped leg with a new one she had shaped herself from a length of hardwood she found in the tool shed, and the table sat level now, which she considered one of the quieter accomplishments of the past 6 weeks. "Flood says the boarding house transfer will be reviewed," she said. "I read the note. It might come back to me." She looked at the lamp. "It might not. The legal process is long and not all of it goes the way it should, even when the evidence is clear." "I know. If it does come back," she paused. "I've been thinking about what I'd do with it, whether I'd go back." He was very still. "I don't want to go back," she said. "That's what I've decided. The building is a building. What I built in it, the years, the work, the systems, that's mine regardless of whether I'm standing inside it. Vane took a building from me. He didn't take what I know how to do." She looked at Wyatt. "I'd rather use what I know how to do here, if that's still what you want." "I told you what I want," he said. "You told me in October. It's December." "I haven't changed my mind in the intervening weeks." She looked at him. He was the kind of man who said things once because he meant them the first time, and repetition was, for him, not reassurance but redundancy. She had come to understand this as a quality rather than a deficiency. "Then we need to talk about the accounts properly," she said. "Not just the immediate operation, but the full picture. What the ranch owes, what it's owed, what the recovery looks like in real numbers over the next 2 years. She put her hands flat on the table. "Because I'm not coming into this blind. If I'm here, I'm part of how it runs, and I need to know what I'm working with." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the front room and came back with the strong box and set it on the table between them. "Everything's in there," he said. "The deed, the tax records, the outstanding debts, the water rights documentation." He sat back down. "I haven't shown it to anyone before." "I know," she said. "I'm showing you now." She opened the strongbox. She went through it the way she went through everything, methodically, completely, taking nothing on faith that the documents themselves could verify. He sat across from her and answered questions when she asked them, and did not try to minimize or soften the parts that were difficult. He was in debt, moderately. He had a credit with the county assessor from an overpayment the previous year. His water rights documentation was, now that the fabricated easement had been removed from the record, cleaner than he had thought. His father's original filings were thorough in a way that reflected a man who had understood that paper was protection. The picture that emerged was not without problems, but it was a picture that could be worked with by two people who understood what working with something difficult required. "The spring grazing lease from the Tilson land," she said. "If you renew it, the cost is offset by the revenue from the expanded herd. Have you run those numbers?" "Not recently." "I'll run them this week." She made a note. "And the supply arrangement with the trading post needs to be renegotiated. The rate I got in October was better than what they had been offering, but it's still not where it should be given the volume we're moving. I want to put together a 3-season proposal and see if they'll commit to a better structure." He looked at her across the strongbox and the documents and the lamp. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since about the 3rd week," she said. "You didn't say anything." "You hadn't asked me to stay yet." She looked up from her notes. "It seemed premature to plan someone else's future without knowing if I'd be part of it." He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand as his version of feeling something strongly. The quality of a man who has learned to keep emotion below the surface, not from coldness, but from the particular discipline of someone who was given responsibility early and discovered that the people depending on him did not need his feelings, they needed his steadiness. You were part of it from the second week, he said. I just didn't know how to say it without it coming out wrong. You said it fine, she said. In October. On the road. You had to wait 3 months for me to manage it. I've waited longer for less. He almost laughed. She had heard him come close to it before. The near laugh was something she had documented alongside the near smile, another item in the vocabulary of his face that she had been learning the way she learned anything she cared about understanding. But this time it completed itself, quiet and genuine, the laugh of a man who has found, in an unlikely place, an unlikely person who says exactly what she means and expects exactly the same in return and will not pretend otherwise to make anyone comfortable. The winter deepened. The accounts were gone through together, and Clara's supply proposal was written and presented to the trading post, and the Tilson lease numbers were run, and the renewal was negotiated. Flood's office sent formal notification in January that the Hargrove family's boundary dispute had been resolved in their favor. The Brennan family's terminated cattle lease was reinstated with damages. Elsie Pruitt's water access was confirmed and protected under the new water rights examination, and Vane's upstream manipulation was formally cited as illegal interference. The boarding house notification came in February. It came as a formal letter from the Territorial Commissioner's office, addressed to Clara Whitmore, delivered to the Callahan Ranch by a county rider who handed it to Pete, who brought it to the kitchen with the solemnity of someone who understood it was significant without knowing what it contained. Clara opened it at the table. She read it through once. The fraudulent transfer of the Whitmore boarding house property had been reversed. The property was returned to her legal ownership, effective upon her formal acknowledgement of receipt of the notice. She had 30 days to respond. She sat with the letter for a long time. Pete had made himself scarce, with the instinct of a young man who was learning when to absent himself from a moment that belonged to someone else. The kitchen was quiet except for the fire. She thought about the building she had run for 11 years. She thought about the kitchen in it, the stove she had known the way she knew her own hands, the pantry she had organized and reorganized across a decade of changing suppliers and changing needs, the table where she had kept her books and run her accounts and tried to make the numbers hold. She thought about Thomas, who had been a decent man with a weakness for arrangements that looked better than they were, and who had died before she found out the full extent of what those arrangements had cost. She thought about a field in late October, and a man on a horse, and a sound of hoofbeats she had not looked up to meet. She got up. She went to find Wyatt. He was in the barn, working on a piece of harness that had been mended twice already and needed a third attention. He looked up when she came in and read her face immediately, the way he read most things, directly and without fuss. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up. "It's yours," he said. "Yes." He waited. "I want to sign it back into the territory," she said. "Not to Vane's holding company. They're dissolved. Into the county's resettlement authority. There are families from the investigation who lost property. They can't recover directly because the chain of ownership is too complicated. The building could be used as..." She stopped. "It could be used for something that matters. I don't need it." He looked at her for a long moment. He had the expression she had learned to read as him processing something that had an emotional weight he was deciding how to hold. "That's a significant thing to give up," he said. "I know what it is." She held his gaze. "I also know what I have here, and I know the difference between what I thought I needed and what I actually need." She paused. "I spent 11 years thinking that building was who I was. It isn't. I was always more than the building. I just needed to be far enough from it to understand that." He handed the letter back. He did not try to talk her out of it or into it. He did not offer an opinion about what she should do with something that was hers to do with as she chose. He simply waited, and she understood in that waiting the particular respect of a person who has decided that your judgment is worth trusting. "I'll need to write a formal response," she said. "We have paper in the front room." "I know," she said. "I've organized every piece of it." He almost laughed again. She turned and went back to the house, and she sat at the kitchen table and wrote the response to the Territorial Commissioner's office in her clearest hand. The hand that had kept 11 years of accounts, that had written statements and cross-references and supply proposals, and a trap for a man who had thought she was beneath his consideration. The hand of a woman who had learned that what she knew how to do was not diminished by the opinion of people who had not taken the time to find out what it was. Spring came to the Callahan Ranch the way spring comes to the high plains, reluctantly, without sentimentality, offering warmth in the daytime and taking it back at night for longer than seemed necessary, as though the land was making sure you understood that it did not owe you anything. Clara had the kitchen garden planted before the last frost had fully released, which Pete considered a reckless optimism, and Burl considered evidence of a woman who understood how to read ground, and they were both somewhat right. The territorial investigation concluded in April. Marcus Vane was convicted on 6 counts of fraud and 2 counts of criminal corruption and sentenced to 7 years in the territorial prison. Holt Greer received 4 years, reduced from the original charge in exchange for the testimony that had made Vane's conviction possible. The East District deputy was permanently barred from law enforcement service in the territory, which was the specific consequence that Harriet Flood had pursued most methodically and which she noted in a letter to Clara gave her the most satisfaction of any outcome in the case. The families who had been affected by Vane's operation received, in most cases, some form of restitution. Not full, because that was not the way these things worked, because the full accounting of what had been taken was too large and too diffuse to be completely repaid through any formal process. But partial. Enough to make the next season possible, enough to replace what had been damaged, enough to confirm that the loss had been real and had been recognized as real, which mattered to people who had spent years being told that their bad luck was their own fault. The boarding house was transferred to the County Resettlement Authority in April, and by May it housed 3 families who were rebuilding from situations similar to Clara's own. People who had lost their homes through legal manipulations that were now under greater scrutiny than they had been before, in part because what Flood had sent to the territorial commissioner had established a precedent and a procedure for exactly this kind of investigation. Clara did not know most of this directly. She knew it through letters and through the writer who occasionally brought news from the county seat, and through Elsie Pruitt, who had become a correspondent in the months since their kitchen conversation, and whose letters had the same quality as their conversation, direct, factual, and occasionally warmer than their style suggested. What she knew directly was the ranch. She knew it in the way you know a place when you have put your hands into its problems and been shaped by its seasons and built something inside it that was the work of your own choosing. She knew the east fence's weakness before a storm. She knew the particular pitch of the well rope when the water table was lower than usual. She knew what the south pasture looked like in early morning when the light came at a specific angle across the grass and the cattle were where they should be, and she knew what it looked like when something was wrong, because she had learned those 2 things by spending enough mornings watching them and caring about the difference. She knew Wyatt's face in all its vocabulary now. The near smile, the near laugh, the way he held his jaw when he was making a difficult decision, the way his hands changed when he was working on something he cared about versus something he was merely enduring. She knew that he rose earlier than anyone and spent 30 minutes alone with the horses before the day began, which was not inefficiency but necessity, the way some people need quiet at the start of things to be able to function in the noise that follows. She knew that he kept a habit of not saying things twice, not because he was cold, but because he understood that saying something once, fully and honestly, was the only real form of it, and that repetition was not emphasis, but erosion. On a morning in late May, she was in the kitchen garden when he came to find her. She was on her knees in the dirt, working the soil around the bean rows with the particular attention of someone who understands that what's underground determines what's above it, which is true in gardens and in most other things. He stood at the edge of the garden and waited until she looked up. "Flood sent word," he said. "She's retiring at the end of the year. She wanted you to know personally." Clara sat back on her heels. She thought about Harriet Flood in a stone building, reading by lamplight, deciding that the scope of the problem deserved the full weight of the authority available to her. "I'd like to write to her," she said. "I thought you might." He held something out, a letter already addressed, with the county seat seal. "She wrote to you first." Clara took the letter. She read it there in the garden with dirt on her hands and the spring air and the sound of the horses in the near paddock. Flood's note was characteristically compressed and characteristically warm in its compression. 2 paragraphs about the case's final outcomes. 1 sentence about the restitution authority the commissioner's office had established as a direct result of the investigation's findings, and a final line that said, "The careful work you built in October would have been sufficient to address one ranch's situation. You chose to build it into something that addressed 20 families' situations instead. That was a choice, not an obligation. I wanted you to know it was noticed." Clara folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She went back to the bean rows. She thought about what it meant, not the recognition, though the recognition mattered in the way that acknowledgement always matters to people who have done real work, but the substance of it. That the choice to build something larger than the immediate problem had been seen for what it was. A choice. Not a reflex, not a strategy, not the automatic expansion of a project beyond its original scope. A decision, made in a specific moment, to treat the experience that had been done to her, not as a private wound but as a map of a pattern that was hurting other people too, and to do something with the map. She had not been unselfish about it. She wanted to be honest about that, at least to herself. She had been angry, and anger had been the engine, and anger is not a selfless thing. But it had found a direction that was useful, and usefulness was not nothing. Usefulness was, in fact, most of what it meant to be a person in the world. Not goodness in the abstract, not virtue as an idea, but the specific capacity to take what you know and apply it somewhere that needed it. She had been a woman with skills and no place to put them. Then she had found a place. Then she had understood that the place was under threat from the same operation that had taken everything from her, and she had applied every skill she had to the problem with the full attention of someone who understood, from personal experience, exactly what was at stake. It was not a story about rescue. That was what she had understood, finally. Not when Wyatt had asked her to stay, not even when Flood's first letter had arrived, but gradually, across the months, in the accumulation of small moments that changed her understanding of herself. She had not been rescued. She had been handed a door by a man on a horse who had enough sense to see that a door was what was needed, and she had walked through it and built what she built with her own hands and her own knowledge and her own particular brand of stubbornness that she had spent too many years calling a flaw. The world had told her she was worthless. The world had been wrong. Not because she was exceptional. She was not, especially, exceptional. She was a woman who had worked hard and paid attention and learned from what she survived and refused, finally, to make herself smaller than she was. The refusal was the thing. The refusal was not dramatic, and it did not announce itself, and it did not arrive all at once. It had come slowly, over 8 months of roads and closed doors and cold fields, until the day she had sat at a kitchen table across from a man who did not want her pity and had told him, with the straightforward directness of a person who has finished apologizing for what they know how to do, "I earned my place through the work, not through anyone feeling sorry for me." That had been the beginning of it. The rest was what followed from that beginning. Wyatt came back to the garden at mid-morning with 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and crouched at the edge of the row and looked at what she had done with the bean section. "That's better spacing than last year," he said. "Last year this was an empty patch of ground. Before you it was." He looked at the rows. "It's a good garden." She looked at it too. It was a good garden. Not impressive, not elaborate. 12 rows of practical vegetables, planted with attention and maintained with daily care. The kind of garden that produces what you need rather than what you wish for. She thought that was about right. She had stopped wishing for things that weren't available to her. She had started working with what was. That was not resignation. That was not the small life of a person who had given up on bigger things. That was something harder to arrive at and more durable once you had it. The understanding that the life you build with your own hands in the soil in front of you is not lesser than the life you imagined in some other version of things. It is, if the work is honest and the people are real and the ground is solid, exactly enough. She drank her coffee in the May morning with dirt on her hands and a letter in her apron pocket, and a man crouched beside her who had asked her once, on a road in October, for exactly what she could give, and had gotten more than he asked for, as people who ask for the right thing often do. The ranch was not finished being built. It never would be. That was the nature of a working ranch, a working life, a working anything. There would be hard seasons and failed crops and fence lines that needed attention and decisions that turned out to be wrong and the ordinary accumulation of difficulties that did not resolve into lessons but simply had to be moved through. That was what the high plains gave you. Not ease, not the absence of consequence, just ground and the chance to work it, and the question of whether you were the kind of person who would. Clara Whitmore had found out, at the edge of a field in late October, that she was exactly that kind of person. She had not needed anyone to tell her. She had just needed the chance to prove it to herself, which was the only